Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be on immigration. I had a really interesting discussion today with, I always host a business event at my house every once a month, and it's just sort of like a support group for entrepreneurs. And what we do is we socialize for the first bit, and then we sort of discuss business ideas afterwards. And the beginning part, we were just socializing. So it's like, we're talking and we're discussing ideas. And immigration came up. And the funny thing is, it's actually kind of a really interesting environment to have this kind of discussion because most of the people that are in the room are immigrants. It's like 90% non-white. It's like totally interesting environment. Um, and I said, hey, I'm pretty open, about my beliefs that I think, mass immigration is bad. I just don't think it's a good system. And I'm pretty open about that. And at the same time, I don't hate immigrants. I'm not anti-immigration in any way, but I think, there's limits to how much immigration one can have. And if you have too many immigrants, they never have the opportunity to assimilate to the culture. That's my personal belief. So I kind of wanted to state that so that you know where I'm coming from when I discuss the topic I'm going to get into now. Um, so I was talking to this one woman, and she's a really nice woman, heart in the right place, that kind of woman. And she said, we're all immigrants. And I was like, not so much. I don't really believe that. Like my family has been in Canada for almost almost 300 years, almost 300 years. And when they came to Canada, they were pioneers. They basically came here. They were settlers. They were trying to set up something in this wilderness. Like Canada had nothing. It was like a bunch of trees and some water, and natives were very sparse in populations. There wasn't that many natives. There was about, they figure any estimates are anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000. Now, if you imagine that number of people living in a land it's the second biggest country in the world, you can imagine that it was pretty sparsely populated. Now, when people came, they settled and they met with the natives, and they fought over land, sure, and they settled. But then, things happened, and more people came, and they took over the nation, basically. And that's kind of what happened. And they actually created a new nation called Canada. And as a result, we took a nation that was really divided into many nations, like there was many different tribes that were all fighting with each other and trying to conquer each other and form their own like nation of whatever it was going to be called by that group. It could have been called Mi'kmaq Nation or Inuit Nation, whatever group had sort of become the dominant group. And that's what would have happened. And they would have created their own system, and they would have spread that throughout the lands that they controlled. And that's how all groups work. Now, whether it's a white group or a native group uh, that ends up with the control doesn't really matter. It, it's what ends up happening. So what happened was the white groups from Europe took over and they created their nation. And they were trying to be actually fairly fair about it. They try to give some land to the natives so that they wouldn't be completely kicked out of their own lands. And they did try to do some things that may be more egalitarian or fair to the people that lived in the lands. I imagine if it was other groups, they probably wouldn't have been so nice about it. They probably, like, there's actual records of natives just slaughtering other groups where they just wiped them out. Um, it's really the Europeans that kind of had this idea of like, don't slaughter, don't slaughter the people, let them have like a bit of life. So we were trying to be nice, and I really don't like the Indian Act that we have in Canada, where the natives are basically treated like they're living in these communist states, and it's really a horrible system that we have. Better than executing them altogether, but really not a great life. And there's lots of issues that surround the native populations as a result. So, so I know this is totally not on topic, but um, so I was talking to this woman, and I kind of want to get back to the story. I was talking to this woman, and she was saying that we're all immigrants, and I was like, not so much. And she was saying, well, we all came over here. The land was really the natives' land, and I kind of gave my explanation for why that's not really the case. But she was saying that we're all just came here. And that was the spirit that really made this country. It's a land of immigration, a land that opportunities that bring people from poor countries that didn't have opportunities, that were either persecuted in their own nation or had some issue in their own nation. And they came here for an opportunity. And that's how she saw it. And if we remove immigration, if we stop the flow of people, then we're ultimately killing that inspiration for the nation. And I really didn't like that way of thinking, but that was her thing. And I said, well, how about the culture? How about the culture of the country? And she said, there is no culture. And that was the part that really, really bothered me. And that's actually what I wanted to talk about right now, is the whole concept of, especially when they talk about white nations like Canada, United States, any European nations, they always say that we have no culture. Even our own prime minister called us a cultureless society. It drove me crazy, because Canada actually has very amazing culture. And it's a culture that we don't appreciate in our own country. And the funny thing is, other countries appreciate it. So when I went to Korea, or when I went to the Philippines, or when I went to Japan, or when I went to like Latin America, like they actually think Canada is a great country, and they have this real understanding of Canadian culture. It's the funniest thing, you don't know what Canadian culture is until you're outside of the country. So crazy, because what was happening is these other countries, they understand what Canadian culture is. Canadian culture is nice people that are, modest for the most part, fairly honest, fairly, interested in other people, fairly open-minded, progressive in many ways. Um, and they see us as, generally nice people to deal with. And that's a culture, believe it or not. It's a different way of acting that other people don't act. Um, and a lot of things with Canadians is people understand us as being very, and some of it's false. Like they think that we're very nature orientated, which is somewhat true, but we mostly live in cities in Canada. Most Canadians are in only a few rural, urban centers within Canada. Um, so yeah, so there's a little bit of misconceptions, but there is this sense of what it is to be a Canadian. And actually, um, when I've traveled, I was amazed by how many people could recognize me as a Canadian. And without, they could have said I was American or some European thing, but they recognized me as my accent, or the way I behaved. The more like Americans are much more boastful and much more arrogant. It's like, sorry, Americans, but it's true. It's the Canadians are a little bit more laid back and a little bit more easygoing, and we're much more modest in many ways. And there's good things and bad things about that. It drives me crazy sometimes. I'm not so much that way, but I tend to boast a bit. So there's elements of Canadian culture that is like, really known outside of Canada. And the funny thing is, with all the immigration that we're having, we're losing that culture. We're losing the things that made us the really great place to live, that people actually aspire to live to, because they see us as being this ideal way. And maybe it's based on like some kind of, false beliefs, But for the most part, they're very true. The ideas that we are, we act a certain way, we do behave a certain way, uh, we try to be good to other people, and these are the traits that people associate with Canada. Um, and they, because they associate those with Canada, they do aspire to live here because they appreciate those traits. But what's happening is those traits are getting lost because we're losing our communities. Like the example I tried to give, and the problem is people, once you say that you're against immigration, they sort of tune out. They stop listening and they just say, "Oh, it feels, it feels, it feels." You know, they get into that emotional argument instead of really thinking about what that person is saying. And what I was really trying to say is like we have to maintain that Canadian culture. And if we just pour in immigrants into the country, we can't possibly maintain that culture because you have to have the culture around the people in order to make them understand what that culture is. Like if there's not enough people that know the culture, then the new people will never learn that culture because there's nobody to teach it to them. Like there's just so many people like themselves that they can never learn the culture that is of Canada, right? So kind of makes sense. Um, so I was saying we got to preserve this. This is important that we save our country, save our culture. And the other argument that always comes up, and it's one of these arguments that really, really bothers me. So the no culture one really bothers me, but this other argument came up that really bothers me too, which is that we need people. We need the immigrants. We need to have more people to come into our country. And that it's all these other countries are having the babies and we just aren't. And, at the end of the day, it's whichever country has the most babies is going to win because their population is going to take over the world. And that's just destiny because they're going to have the babies and we're not having the babies. So therefore, the babies are going to come here and take over our land. And that's actually true to a certain extent because if you don't enforce your borders, if you allow for mass immigration, then yes, other lands that have more babies will come in and they will take over your country. They will definitely dominate because if you don't enforce your borders, then foreigners can come into your country and they can take over and they can create their own culture within your country and they will establish that culture as the dominant culture. But we don't have to let that happen. We don't need to keep our borders open all the time. We don't need to force massive numbers of people into our country. We can survive with the population we have already. We can actually control our own population. This is a time where we can actually protect our own borders. And countries have been protecting their own borders for thousands of years. Why all of a sudden do we have to have these open borders where everybody can just walk into the country and become Canadian or whatever country it is that they are entering? We we should have a policy that maintains our culture, that maintains what we are as a society. And if we didn't have this mass influx of people, what would happen is probably our population would go down. I imagine it would, because we are older population. Most Canadians are actually fairly old. Um, and there's not enough children. But generally what would happen is you'd have this decline, natural decline of the population. And eventually, as the population declines, what happens is there's scarcity of people, resources. And when there's scarcity of people and resources, what ends up happening, if you block the borders, so you have to maintain that, what happens when you have that scarcity is that people have to pay more for local labor. And when people pay more, that means that people that were working can afford to have more. They can say, well, hey, I didn't think I could have a child because it's just so expensive to have a child. But now I'm earning more. I can actually maybe afford that child. And they'll think more like that. And you'll actually have a shift. Right now, the shift is towards having less children because it's so expensive to have a child. But once there's that shift back to scarcity of labor, you'll have the opposite happen where there'll be a desire for people to have children because there's a demand for those children, and there's actually it's easier to have children because you're being paid more, that you have the opportunities. Another thing that we have to do in order to get to that point quicker is to reduce the size of government. The government really kills it. Actually, the funny thing is, as you bring in more immigrants, immigrants have a like nothing against immigrants. I don't think they're bad people, but generally the problem with immigrants is they don't have a whole bunch of issues. They have a whole bunch of problems that they bring with them. Some are language issues. Some are need of home, some basic things. Like they have all those issues. And generally in Canada, we use the government to solve those issues. And it's very expensive. It costs a lot of money to bring in immigrants. And they're a bit of a drain on the system. Well, as they drain the system, uh, it requires more government and more money to be spent. Well, that money comes from somewhere. It has to come from those who are already contributing to the system. So generally what happens is the local population becomes poorer as you bring in more immigrants. And it's actually pretty staggering how fast the local population is suffering from the cost of immigration. I did the math once, and it works out to 1% per year of loss of wealth for the local population as you bring in more and more immigrants. So it's actually quite substantial. If you think it sounds like a little amount, but 1%, but it adds up very, very quickly. And it can be a major drain on the local population. So what ends up happening is, as I said, you get the situation where if you keep on increasing the size of government, keep on bringing in more and more immigrants, well, that can actually stop the local population from being able to support a family, support the idea of having a child, because they just can't afford it. Their income isn't going as far as it could. Also, immigration has a tendency of lowering wages, which makes it even more difficult for people to find labor that will allow them to have a family. So the immigration thing it's one of these kind of ways that government thinks. It drives me crazy the way governments think. Governments think in 4-year increments. So if you think in 4-year increments, you think of what is the problem right now? The problem is, we don't have enough labor. Okay, well, in a 4-year mentality, you think, well, gee, how do you get more labor? Well, we'll just import it. Like, we'll just bring in a whole bunch of people. And what that does is as I said, it exacerbates the problem because now those immigrants are costing more to the system, and it's making it harder for the local people. Even the immigrants that come in are having less children than they would in their previous country. So you just so these new immigrants don't really bring in the population that you would expect because they're not having huge amounts of children here compared to where they were before. And what ends up happening is you need more immigrants. So you bring in more, and then it's like more of the same issue. And what happens is you're just creating a bigger and bigger problem. And that's because you're only thinking in 4-year increments, because that's the election cycle. Every 4 years we have an election. So a government only thinks in their short 4-year mandate rather than thinking long term. Like if you're thinking long term, you're saying, well, maybe we should kind of slow down immigration. Yes, we can have some immigration, but let's think of what can help our local population have children if we need the labor. And the other problem that we do have in Canada is there's actually too many people. It sounds weird that I said that we have this population shortage, but then I also say we have too many people, and I'll explain that a little bit. One of the things is, as I said, we're an older population, so we do have a shortage by the fact that eventually people are going to retire and they're going to fall out of the system, and we need some people to replace that. That's a natural problem, and that's labor shortage. But we also have an issue with too many people. And the reason I say that there's too many people is what happens in Canada, and this is truly a Canadian problem, is most of our country is empty. It's like a big wasteland, actually. It's like, you don't, not many people live beyond a certain uh, latitude, you know, or, it's like after they get a certain distance north, there's just no people. It's just not the environment that you would want to live in. So when people come to Canada, they live in very focused areas. So most immigration happens in really only a few cities, Toronto and Vancouver. And what happens is you get massive numbers of people coming into those small areas, and it just drives up the housing prices. So that's one of the big complaints. People can't afford to live here. Even a semi-detached house is over $1 million. It's like, who can afford that, right? It's really expensive to live in these little areas because it's just so many people, competition for the homes, and it just drives the price up. So we got a real problem there. And people don't want to move out of those areas because most of the jobs are in those two cities. It's like, so there's that situation where it just creates this big problem where like we just have too many people, and they're, as the immigrants come in, they lower the wages because there's more people than jobs. And that always creates a problem with supply and demand. So what ends up happening is people are getting paid less, but they need to earn more because the competition for housing is more expensive. And it's like all these issues where in a way, we have too many people. And it's a real complicated situation where we have too few and too many at the same time, which sounds very contradictory, but I hope that it makes sense the way I explained it. So this is the situation. This is the situation with immigration. One is the concept of losing culture. And to me, I think Canadian culture is worth preserving. I think Canadians are good people. And when I say Canadians, I mean people that have adopted that Canadian culture. And I know, as I said, the group that I was with today, they're mostly people from many different cultures. And they have adopted that Canadian culture. So it's not a white thing. That's not the way I'm thinking here. It's a Canadian thing, and they have adopted that culture. And when they adopt that culture, it's a beautiful thing because they've assimilated to it. Because it is what made the country great. This Canadian culture, this whole people in Canada are so good in their nature that it's something that I'd love to see preserved, and something that I aspire to say that should be spread around the world, but I'm not going to like colonize the world with Canadian values. I think, having it in Canada is a really great thing. And I think, we should maintain that. I really want to maintain my culture. So this has been Socially Triggered. I hope this story, a bit of a rant, I admit. I hope this story has been interesting. I'd like to hear your opinions. Does Canada have a culture? Is it worth preserving that culture? What do you think about immigration? What do you think people should do with the problems of too many people and too few people? What are your thoughts on this? And is Canada truly a land of immigrants? Is there more to the story? I tried to give a little brief history there. So I hope you can kind of give me some feedback in the comments, and please check out my other videos. I talk about pretty much everything. So yeah, thanks for watching, and bye for now.